Everybody, I got bad news. We've been cancelled.
When does a show become bad? Far too many just limp along in their later seasons with occasional good moments but slowly declining. Family Guy did have a clear production benchmark, its cancellation and subsequent renewal. I'd recommend you watch my video on the first 3 seasons where I explain how different they were. We could say after this the show got bad. Things are never that simple in reality. Family Guy came back with some promise in season 4. Was this just holdover episodes from pre-cancellation production, the writing staff working especially hard for their second chance? Or was this a promise of enduring quality? Far from being a show with a clear drop-off, Family Guy to this day can still be great, so explaining the broad downward trend is more of an art than a science. The next 3 seasons are just the first chapter in that decline. I could spend this whole video just talking about season 4, because somehow this one season ended up being 30 episodes long. Season 6 only had 12 episodes, so things sort of balance out, but I don't know why they came back with a 30 episode season. I was so shocked I went to check my Family Guy DVD collection for if the season 4 box set looked noticeably bigger, and the answer is, it didn't, because it didn't even have all of season 4 on it. The seasons, according to the UK DVD releases, are radically different from how they were aired on Fox, to the extent that they're over one whole season out of sync with the actual seasons. The season 8 DVD set has episodes from season 6 on it. I bring this up because my initial impression of the declining quality of the show was based on the DVDs, which don't reflect the show's actual release, so I've done some mental recalibration to account for that. Considering this huge number of episodes, I've allowed myself to skip the 3 episodes that comprise Stewie Griffin The Untold Story, because that's really its own thing and I don't have much to say about it. I'm also not looking at the extra long episode that makes up episode 4 of the Family Guy Star Wars trilogy, because that's also really its own thing and I have so much to say about it that I'm going to dedicate a future video to that trilogy alone. Look forward to that relatively soon. But for now, let's get into seasons 4 to 6 and how Family Guy changed. I had a comment on my seasons 1 to 3 breakdown saying the show was funnier after its early years. This wouldn't be so insane, some find The Simpsons funnier after its early seasons. I went into this rewatch thinking maybe I would find these episodes funnier. Truth is, I still think the comedy peaked before cancellation. If somebody really likes absurdist comedy, then they would prefer seasons 4 to 6, because there are a lot more jokes that are willfully stupid in these seasons. Some of them are jokes that I honestly do like.
It tastes kind of different than usual. Oh my god, there's a bear in my oatmeal!
But on balance, I prefer the marginally more grounded humour of the early seasons. You might think the big comedic change would be in how offensive it got. I previously described early Family Guy as having a quaint tone. The humour definitely did become more edgy.
I got postpartum depression. Wah! I'm sad about stuff. Wah!
But I was surprised at how tame it remained. Some gross out and violent humour started to emerge here, but when it comes to socio-political offensiveness, it's not actually that extreme, except for maybe a few infamous moments. But the offensiveness doesn't bother me, nor does the move towards absurdist comedy. Nope, something else speaks to the show's decline, and that is the number of unfunny jokes that go on too long. This is something less noticeable when you're watching the show on your own, but watching this show with other people is the true litmus test for comedy. I still remember cringing into my seat when watching this show with other people because there's nothing more awkward than a minute-long joke that nobody is laughing at. Even some of the jokes I at one point found funny have a limited shelf life if they go on too long. Even if I laughed at these jokes initially, I can't sustain laughter for a solid minute at a joke I've already seen several times before, so eventually, inevitably, I'll just be left staring vacantly at a joke that goes on for ages. And then there's the real harbinger of decline, Mr. Conway Twitty. I've complained about how Family Guy does reference comedy before, I'll link that video in the description. One observation I can add though, is that many of the jokes reference individuals with criticisms that don't hold up, specifically jokes about various celebrities being talentless and unlikable. Matthew McConaughey, Colin Farrell, and Jake Gyllenhaal all get lampooned with that criticism. All three of those actors are now generally viewed quite favourably and as being very talented. McConaughey had True Detective, Farrell has starred in several acclaimed art films, as has Gyllenhaal. It's an interesting weakness of reference comedy I'd never considered. There's a risk that whoever you're referencing might evolve as an individual and make your observations seem baseless.
You suck donkey ass.
You can't prove that.
On a more positive note, we have the rise of the conversational comedy for which Family Guy is now pretty famous, often taking the form of a would-you-rather discussion between the guys, but with several character dynamics we see this everyday observational back-and-forth style showing up.
Why does Emperor Palpatine have a desk?
Huh?
In that scene where Yoda comes in and they're about to have that big fight, Emperor Palpatine clearly gets up from his desk. Was he like, Yoda, what do you need, and will it take longer than 5 minutes? I am absolutely swamped.
Finally, and possibly most significantly, this show now has a lot of meta-comedy, especially a lot of jokes about the cutaway format.
It's like giving a monkey the keys to an amusement park.
How is that?
How is what?
How is it anything like a monkey having the keys to an amusement park?
I don't know. The hours would be erratic. Maintenance would probably suffer to some degree.
Also, a lot of jokes about the illogical continuity of the show.
Bonnie, you've been pregnant for like 6 years, all right? Either have the baby or don't.
And I'd also count the chicken fight jokes as vaguely meta for how self-aware they are in completely interrupting the narrative flow. I say this is significant because it feels like a sign of a declining sitcom. If they're already making so many jokes poking fun at their own tropes, how much more can they sustain the show unironically? One option would be to change the nature of the show to respond to these meta jokes, but they didn't really do that. The alternative is that they keep making the same show the same way even after having made fun of it, which implies a lack of interest in evolving for the better. This is why I view it as a big sign of the show's decline, even though I do find some of the meta jokes perfectly funny. If nothing else, I enjoy the fact Disney now legally owns this joke.
Plus, Walt Disney was an outspoken anti-Semite. So Disney, ABC, ESPN, Touchstone, these would all be things to avoid.
I started with humor because I think Family Guy was becoming even more of a pure comedy around this time, which is to say, the plot mattered increasingly little. Even pre-cancellation, the show would sometimes fail to have an emotionally satisfying conclusion or properly resolve a conflict. Well, at this point it's fair to say the show just stopped caring. Not only did we get disappointing conclusions to stories, now that lack of care is everywhere. I usually speak about the seasons as a whole, but just for this section I'd like to take 4 specific episodes as case studies for how underdeveloped and disappointing the plots started to become. In chronological order, we start with Blind Ambition. It starts off with the idea that Quagmire's criminal pervert behaviour is no longer acceptable. He struggles to control it and ends up freaking out and running to the security office of a clothing store where he sees a woman having a heart attack and resuscitates her.
What the hell, CPR?
Peter then gets jealous of Quagmire because he's now seen as a hero for saving somebody's life. He decides he wants notoriety, so he starts eating nickels to set a world record for most nickels eaten, which I guess is somehow a pretty high record because he eats a lot of them, so many in fact that he turns blind. However, in being blind, he accidentally walks into a burning building without realizing and saves somebody's life. Now obviously that progression of events is nonsense, and there are 3 potential stories all smashed together. Quagmire trying to rein in his perverted antics, Peter trying to get famous by breaking a world record, and Peter going blind and struggling with that. You have 3 underdeveloped thirds of a story stitched into one. Next we have Brian Sings and Swings. In this episode, Brian starts hanging out with Frank Sinatra Jr., and he just starts drinking out of nowhere. It's not really set up at all. It comes across very much like a conflict just tacked onto a story about Brian hanging out with Frank Sinatra Jr. It almost feels like there's somebody high up in the production of Family Guy who's a massive fan of this type of music, and the actual plot of the episode took a back seat to this person's obsession with the celebrity guest. As far as I know, however, no such person exists. So I don't know why this plot is so underdeveloped. Then there's Patriot Games, which already starts off with the pretty unrealistic premise of Peter joining the New England Patriots. However, to be fair, wacky premises don't automatically make an episode bad. The main issue with the episode is that Peter is called out by Tom Brady for showboating, but this is resolved by Brady telling Peter he was brave for taking on the whole team.
For one guy to stand up to the entire New England Patriots team, that's a winner in my book.
even though Peter's bravery was never in question. Also, this episode is sort of a travel episode because the family briefly moves to England because Peter is playing American football. The episode where Peter plays American football is the episode where they decide to move the Griffins from America to England. Because obviously, why else would somebody move to England except to play American football? And then finally, there's the episode Muckstroke, where Peter grows a mustache and thus is assumed to be a fireman, and when he saves a burger restaurant from burning down, he's given free burgers for life. He ends up abusing this, eating a huge number of burgers, having a stroke, and then suing the restaurant. Aside from the typical nonsense plot progression, this episode abandons its own point in the final third. Obviously, Peter suing the restaurant is ridiculous. They gave him free burgers as a kind gesture, and he chose to eat a huge amount. The episode acknowledges this is nonsense.
It's their fault I had a stroke, Brian, and I'm gonna sue them for it.
Peter, you ate 30 hamburgers. It was your own fault.
But for some reason, the final third pivots to presenting the burger restaurant as the bad guys because they're making beef from sentient, intelligent cows. I don't know why they did this. I've previously blamed the cutaway format for the lackluster plots of the early seasons, but in this case, that's not the issue. These aren't good plots that just lack time spent exploring them, they're plots that are totally unfocused, unmotivated, and illogical. Irrelevant Act 1s in sitcoms aren't unheard of. The Simpsons does this all the time. But with Family Guy, you don't just have irrelevant first acts, you have irrelevant entire plots. Like I say, this is because the show was turning into more of a pure comedy at this point, but since I've already explained that holes in the comedy were already emerging, that's not a great sign. If I was limited to presenting just one thing as the singular difference between seasons 4 to 6 and 1 to 3, it would actually be how much more political the show gets. And they're incredibly partisan in how they handle politics. They're very much leading with their, what's the word?
Textbook liberal agenda.
Yeah, that's it. I could just list off examples of all the political issues they bring up. The Iraq War, illegal immigration, gay marriage, abstinence-only sex education, stem cell research, the No Child Left Behind policy. I'm stopping for time, not for lack of examples. But what's the reason for this sudden hardcore pivot towards politics compared to the earlier seasons? I'm going to try to present the obvious explanation as objectively as possible. Most of the early seasons were occurring before George Bush, and especially before 9/11. Generally, the politics of the early 2000s position the conservative right as the vanguards of censorious moral outrage and restrictions to civil liberties. Seth MacFarlane seems a quite typical coastal liberal. That's why this show hates George Bush, but sort of loves Bill Clinton. I mean, they present him as adulterous because it's Clinton, you can't exactly get away with denying that. However, we're clearly not supposed to be morally offended by it, and aside from that, they call him a good president.
I mean, Peter, the man presided over the longest economic expansion in U.S. history, and he reduced the percentage of Americans on welfare to its lowest level in 33 years.
In contrast to this, they love presenting George Bush as a complete moron, to the point where one of the first things we hear from a character to communicate that she's dumb is that she agrees with the Patriot Act.
Well, I just think, for starters, that sometimes the government has things they can't tell us, and truthishly, we should just accept that.
Okay, good night, everyone.
They literally have an episode where Peter goes back in time and changes history so that Al Gore wins the 2000 election instead of Bush, and the resultant world is a utopia.
With President Gore's universal health care, people are living much longer these days.
And with zero-tolerance gun control and a strong, well-funded educational system, there's no street crime.
With this said, I think the partisan liberal politics probably peaked in this era, because nowadays the political climate is not one where censorious moral outrage is viewed as coming only or even predominantly from the right. Honestly, I could do a whole video of this length just on the way these seasons handle politics. I have so many notes I'm leaving on the cutting room floor here. But I'll wrap this section up with a salient point of comparison. In Season 3, the Griffin family head to the southern US to escape a violent criminal. While the episode does make fun of the Deep South, it ultimately ends with a message of solidarity, where the local community rallies around the Griffins and protects them.
Well, we take care of our own, and as long as y'all live here, Y'all are Southerners too.
In Season 5, the Griffins move to Texas to escape a fundamentalist religious mob who are convinced Stewie is satanic.
We're going to Texas in search of religious tolerance?
The lampooning of Texan culture is much more focused on political issues.
What's this?
That's your gun. Buy some liquor, get a free gun.
Is that like a special you have on now or something?
Nope, Texas state law.
And the ultimate conclusion to the episode is that Peter's friends try to execute him without trial, and the Griffins get run out of town by a violent, angry mob. I think the starkness of that contrast speaks volumes about how the show changed its attitude. My expectation was that these seasons would flesh out the wider cast of the show. Honestly, they don't particularly. They introduce a lot more characters who have very specific gimmicks, but for the time being, these characters are limited to their gimmicks. Adam West mostly just continues being weird in a way that is admittedly funny, and Herbert keeps being a bit suspect in a way that is also admittedly funny.
Are you a pedophile?
These characters do get some spotlight moments, but nothing to massively build on their characters. A really good example of how focused this show was on secondary character gimmicks can be found in the vaudeville duo.
Damn! Play me off, Johnny!
These guys appear so many times in Season 4, and then in Season 5 they're killed off. This show blew through gimmick characters so quickly that it went from introducing them to cathartically murdering them in the space of one season. The only two characters I'd say get real development would be Carter Pewterschmidt and Tom Tucker. Adam West is a close third. Carter gets a pretty good episode dedicated to him losing his money and then learning to live as a poorer person. Tom Tucker gets a much sillier episode where he becomes Peter's stepdad and Peter reverts to being a complete child. However, silly as the episode is, Tucker's personality does make an impression. Aside from this, we have the main gang. Joe's characterization is decidedly in the balance here. In the earlier seasons, he's a pretty dignified character. At this point, it's 50-50 for him. He still does have moments where he exudes confidence and strength, most obviously the episode where he is briefly able to walk. You might say it doesn't count if they make him cool by having him walk. However, it's not just about the physical. It shows that Joe still has a positive and commanding mentality. The big issue for Joe, and the real sign of things to come, is in his relationship with Bonnie. There's still some moments where the spark is there, but Bonnie expresses dissatisfaction with Joe's inability to walk. Right at the end of the very last episode of Season 6, we have this moment.
We had sex.
We had sex!
We had what Joe calls sex.
Like I say, his character hung in the balance, but by the end of this era, things really start to lean in one direction. As for Quagmire, I really don't have much to say about him. He almost becomes as one-note as a lot of the side characters in terms of jokes. I already mentioned they did an episode where his behavior was called out, but they didn't meaningfully follow up on that. Aside from this, he has one episode where he gets married and completely changes his personality. Thing is, it's such a personality switch, you can't really take anything away from it except just, hey, remember that time when Quagmire suddenly acted completely out of character for an episode? That was weird. While I'm on the subject of Quagmire though, I said in my last video that the early seasons were filled with sexual moments. That dramatically falls off here. That might relate to the socio-political context already discussed. I suspect it's not a coincidence that this is also the era where we get the song calling out the FCC and conservative prudes censoring television. I really wanted to come up with something to say about Cleveland this time. I still can't do it. Yes, he gets the episode about being cheated on, and he gets the subsequent episode where he tries to find a girlfriend, but to put into perspective how little they actually care about Cleveland, when he does get a new girlfriend, there isn't even an episode dedicated to it. She just randomly shows up as his girlfriend already. If I had to pick just one character dynamic to spotlight in this video, it would be Stewie and Brian. Family Guy got into this pairing pre-cancellation, and here they really committed to it. There's only one Road to episode in this whole 3 seasons, which is surprising, but maybe this is because the Brian and Stewie pairing had become so frequent they didn't need to limit it to just that format. Instead, you get Stewie starting a pyramid scheme and Brian working for him, or the two starting a radio show together, or working on renovating a house. Every time these two are paired up, it's the highlight of the episode. I'm really glad they realized the benefits of this dynamic here. A common joke in this era is Brian occasionally acting like a dog and Stewie acting like a baby. It's juxtaposed with how they're normally portrayed. Focusing on Brian being a sentient dog or Stewie being a super smart baby is great for a few episodes, but eventually Unfortunately, if you want to tell other stories about these characters, them being a dog and a baby has to become less relevant. Good news is, this means the show can always get some comedy out of every now and then bringing the reality of what they actually are back into focus. Speaking of what they actually are, in the early seasons, Stewie being an evil genius is very much front and center. In these seasons, we see that decline. In fact, at one point, he's presented more as heroic than evil.
And don't ever let me catch you guys in Quahog!
Regarding Lois, he's all over the place. At one point he loves her, then he bonds with Peter over hurting her, and realizes himself that he's been neglecting his efforts to actually kill her. But the big moment for Stewie's villainality, is when he tries to kill Lois in season 6. When I start the seasons 7 to 9 review, I'll probably look back on this as the last hurrah for him as a villain. When it's revealed it's just a simulation, he takes it as proof things wouldn't go well for him if he tried to kill Lois. Well, that pretty much closes the book on future attempts. But let's address the big question. The question we always have to ask about Stewie. How gay is he? Well, I'm sorry to report that there are still distinct moments of him being attracted to women.
Ugh, tell me about it. I haven't seen one female baby since we got here. This place is a sausage fest.
They also make several jokes about him being a cross-dresser rather than necessarily gay, although at another point he's disgusted by Brian being a cross-dresser. What a hypocrite. He definitely gets gayer and gayer over the progression of these seasons, and with increasingly less ambiguity. They even decided that Stewie could be gay for Brian. I'll be honest, I don't like this. I don't think Stewie should be gay for Brian. I am a well-known, hardcore, stupid fanboy.
Stewie, we've been playing for half an hour.
Oh, okay. You want to go ride the teabags? Teacups? Teabags?
The other reason, of course, why I don't think Stewie should be into Brian is because Brian is a giant douche. This is the big change in Brian's character, the idea he's actually a pretty rubbish human being. We see this in how shallow he is about women, and how easily he's suckered into relationships on superficial pretenses. We see it in how he's inattentive to his son Dylan, and when he tries to be a good parent he becomes obnoxious about that too. There's also the whole running joke about his terrible novel. These seasons establish that Brian is actually not smart, since he tries his best at college and still fails. This is a big development for Brian. In the early seasons he was presented as a genuinely thoughtful, intelligent guy. That characterization goes out the window, which I actually prefer. It's better to have his ego be checked more often. Let's wrap up with the rest of the Griffins and how they changed in these seasons. Peter's one big change is becoming way more stupid. In fact, he became literally, medically, I'm not sure I can even say the word, even if it's medically accurate.
We prefer the term mentally hilarious.
In some sense, this is bad, making him a less complex character. However, insofar as the show is now a pure comedy, it's not terrible having such a stupid character. Shockingly, Peter actually becomes a marginally better person here. In the early seasons, he's smart enough that he has to be actively thoughtless in the episodes where he's a bad person. Here, he's so stupid that he kind of circles around to being childlike, innocent, and ultimately quite loving. I mean, he's still Peter Griffin, don't get me wrong, but he and Lois have some sweet plots together here. In the earlier seasons, there were a lot more marriage squabbles. Unfortunately, he also has some awful moments, not all of which are just from being stupid. His worst moment is easily when he rejects Joe as a friend because he thinks handicapped people aren't cool and ruin the image of his new restaurant. He does end up punished by the narrative here, so the show overall has some sense of morality. Let's talk about Peter's better half. Don't worry, at this point she's still decidedly his better half. Lois continues to be written like a traditional sitcom mum. She worries about and takes care of her children and husband, albeit in more wacky situations. However, we start to see a bit more of Lois's wild side creep in.
And another that says sperm dumpster, and they're all written in glitter.
Somehow this also ends up kind of working out for Lois and Peter's relationship though. She becomes a bit less wholesome, but in doing so, sort of goes down to Peter's level, which again might explain why they start getting along better. They even have episodes about Lois pushing back against the expectations placed on her by others and getting a bit rebellious. I guess the one thing I should mention is that she does cheat on Peter with Bill Clinton. Infidelity was the line The Simpsons famously refused to cross. Family Guy blows right past it. But even that episode somehow has a wholesome ending. Speaking of infidelity though, these seasons really ratchet up Brian pining for Lois. File this under the Brian being a jerk section as well. Brian is actually worse than Quagmire here for just how persistent he is, to the point of even throwing himself at her physically. At least they usually pair this with plots where Peter is more of a jerk, because like I say, Peter is still a jerk quite often, and I guess in that context Brian can kind of be excused for feeling like he'd be better for Lois. Still, it's not cool.
Gotta work on that, man. Bad dog.
As for Meg, I already spoke about her a lot in the previous video, so I'll be brief here. They mostly just ratchet up a lot of what we've already seen. She is still the punching bag of the show. Nonetheless, she also still gets episodes where she's treated like an actual character, she still has standards, she still has episodes where she wins, and she even has a boy who quite unambiguously likes her. It's not that things don't get worse for Meg, they very much do, but it's gradual and pretty much a continuation of a trend that can be seen in the early seasons too. Again, check out my breakdown of the early seasons for more of my thoughts there. The big loser of seasons 4 to 6 isn't Meg, it's actually Chris. Not necessarily because the narrative is particularly cruel to him, although that is true sometimes.
Oh my God, could you leave me alone? You are the neediest kid!
Mostly, he just has less of a character generally. He only gets a handful of episodes where he plays a significant role. Generally, he's presented as a nice person, but there's not one episode that really explores Chris on a deeper level. By the way, Chris got totally screwed. In one episode, Stewie tries to impress Olivia and learns from Quagmire that being a jerk is a good way to get a girl's attention. He implements this and it works for him. Meanwhile, Chris gets the exact same advice from Peter.
You want to get anywhere with a chick, you can't treat him too nice-like.
And it doesn't work out for him at all. Poor Chris just can't win. Anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that you were able to watch my breakdown of seasons 1 to 3 and found this to be a good follow-up. Make sure to watch my breakdown of seasons 7 to 9, which should be available to click here, now, once it's up. In the meantime, this will link to a different video I'm sure you'll enjoy, so make sure to click that and tell the algorithm you liked this content. Bye.
Oh. Were we done cheering?